The dim candlelight flickered against the polished wooden coffin resting solemnly at the center of the church. Heavy silence filled the air, broken only by quiet sobs and the murmured prayers of grieving family members. A faint scent of incense mixed with the fresh flowers that adorned the altar, their beauty unable to mask the overwhelming sorrow that clung to the room. Among the mourners stood a small child, Lucy, only 5 years old, her tiny hands clutching the fabric of her mother's black dress. Her wide, tear-filled eyes never left the coffin. As the priest spoke solemn words of farewell, she suddenly took a shaky step forward, raising a trembling finger. "Daddy's not gone," she whispered at first, her voice barely audible. Then, more urgently, she cried out, "Daddy's still there. He's not supposed to be in there." Murmurs spread through the room as Clara, her mother, quickly knelt beside her, grasping Lucy's arms gently but firmly. "Sweetheart," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion, "Daddy is—" But before she could finish, Lucy jerked away, her small body shaking with desperate energy. "No, Mommy. He's stuck. We have to help him," she pleaded, pulling at her mother's sleeves, her nails digging into the fabric. Clara's breath hitched as she fought back tears. She was already drowning in grief, barely holding herself together, and now her daughter's distress added another weight to her already broken heart. Taking Lucy's face in her hands, she wiped away the hot tears streaming down the little girl's cheeks. "Baby, Daddy he's resting now," she whispered, though her voice wavered. Lucy shook her head violently, her sobs turning into gasps. "No, he's calling for me. He said my name," she wailed, her voice piercing the stillness of the church. Some mourners exchanged uneasy glances, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The priest hesitated mid-sentence, looking toward Clara with sympathy. Clara hugged Lucy tightly, rocking her gently, whispering soothing words she could barely believe herself. Yet deep inside, an unsettling chill crept up her spine. Lucy's words, her frantic insistence, was it simply the confusion of a grieving child, or was there something more? The flickering candlelight cast long shadows against the walls as the church fell into a tense, uneasy silence. Clara's arms tightened around Lucy as she felt the child trembling violently in her embrace. The girl's small fingers clutched at her dress with an urgency that sent shivers down Clara's spine. The air in the church, once filled with quiet sorrow, now felt thick and suffocating, as if an invisible weight pressed down on the mourners. Lucy's cries had quieted into uneven gasps, her chest rising and falling as she tried to catch her breath. But her eyes, those wide, fearful eyes, remained fixed on the coffin. She was no longer sobbing uncontrollably, but her body was tense, her lips quivering with words she seemed too afraid to say. Clara cupped her daughter's face gently, wiping away the damp streaks on her cheeks. "Lucy," she whispered, her voice barely steady, "what did you hear?" For a moment, the child hesitated. Her small hands gripped her mother's wrists as if drawing strength from the warmth of her touch. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost lost in the silence, she whispered, "Daddy called my name." A cold chill ran through Clara's veins. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "Baby," she said, trying to reason with her, "sometimes when we miss someone so much, we think we hear them." But Lucy shook her head violently. "No, Mommy. I did hear him." Her voice rose with renewed desperation. "He said, 'Lucy, help me.'" Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few mourners shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other with unease. The priest furrowed his brows but remained silent, gripping his Bible a little tighter. Clara's fingers curled into the fabric of her dress. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, but the words still stuck in her throat. It wasn't just Lucy's words that disturbed her, it was the way she said them. The certainty, the fear, the undeniable belief in her voice. Kneeling beside her daughter, she forced a small, reassuring smile, though her hands trembled slightly. "Lucy, sweetheart," she said, stroking the child's hair, "Daddy is at peace now." "He—" Before she could finish, Lucy suddenly stiffened. Her little hand shot out, pointing directly at the coffin. "Mommy, look," she cried. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she followed her daughter's gaze. The entire room seemed to freeze. The candles flickered violently, their flames dancing unnaturally. Then, a single, muffled thump came from inside the coffin. A deafening silence followed. Someone in the back let out a choked gasp. The priest's knuckles went white as he clutched his Bible tighter. A woman in the front row covered her mouth, eyes wide with terror. Clara's heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear anything else. Her vision blurred as panic took hold of her, every muscle in her body locking in place. Then another sound, a weak, slow scratching from inside the coffin. Lucy's grip on her mother's hand tightened as she whispered, "Mommy, Daddy's not gone." The heavy wooden doors of the church creaked open, their sound cutting through the tense silence like a blade. Every head in the room turned toward the entrance, eyes wide with a mix of fear and anticipation. The dim light from outside cast a long shadow across the threshold before a tall figure stepped inside. Henry. Clara's breath caught in her throat. He stood there, framed by the doorway, his sharp eyes scanning the room. His dark coat was damp from the drizzle outside, and his boots left faint marks on the church floor as he stepped forward. The flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows across his face, making the sharp angles of his jaw appear even more defined. For a moment, no one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the faint rustling of Henry's coat as he walked further inside, his expression unreadable. His presence alone sent an icy shiver down Clara's spine. Lucy, still clutching her mother's hand, let out a small gasp. "Uncle Henry," she whispered, barely audible. Henry's gaze softened slightly as he looked at the little girl. But when his eyes flicked toward the closed coffin, his jaw clenched. "I heard what happened," he said, his voice low but firm. "Tell me everything." The mourners exchanged uneasy glances. No one dared to speak at first. The weight of Lucy's words, "Daddy called my name," still lingered in the air like a ghostly whisper. The faint scratching from inside the coffin had stopped, but the memory of it clung to Clara's skin like frost. Clara swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. "Lucy," she said she heard him, she murmured, her voice barely above a breath. "She swears he spoke to her." Henry's eyes darkened. Slowly, he approached the coffin, his gloved fingers grazing the polished wood. "And the sound?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Another silence. Then, from the back of the room, an elderly man cleared his throat. "We all heard it," he admitted, his voice shaking. Something moved inside." Henry exhaled sharply. He rested one hand on the lid of the coffin, his fingers tapping against the surface as if expecting a response. The entire room held its breath. Clara felt her pulse hammering in her ears. "Henry," she whispered urgently, "what are you thinking?" His eyes met hers, dark and intense. "If he's in there," he said slowly, "we need to open it." A collective gasp rippled through the mourners. Someone murmured protest. Another clutched their rosary tighter. The priest took a hesitant step forward. "This is madness," he warned. "The dead do not return." Henry ignored him. His hand tightened into a fist. "We're about to find out." Then, before anyone could stop him, he reached for the coffin's lid and lifted it. As the coffin lid creaked open, the air inside the church thickened, heavy with the weight of collective dread. The mourners stood frozen, their eyes locked on the polished wood as Henry slowly pushed it aside. The faint scent of aged pine and something else, something damp and cloying, rose into the room. Clara's breath hitched. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms as she braced for what lay beneath. The body remained still, cold, pale, unmoving. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a woman in the back let out a shaky breath, half a sob, half a prayer. "See," the priest said, his voice thick with strained reassurance. "This is just grief playing tricks on us." But Henry didn't move away. His gaze remained fixed on the corpse. His fingers hovered just above the man's stiff hands, as if expecting them to twitch. The silence became suffocating, pressing against Clara's ribs. Lucy, still clutching her mother's hand, whispered, "He spoke to me." "I know he did." A chill crept through the room. Whispers spread among the mourners like wildfire, uncertainty gnawing at their composure. What if Lucy hadn't imagined it? What if the sound hadn't been the wind? Clara could see it in their eyes, the doubt, the fear. Rationality waged war against something deeper, something primal. The unease in the room was no longer just about grief. It was about the possibility. Then Henry did something that made every breath in the room halt. He reached into the coffin and touched the corpse's hand. And the corpse moved. A single, unmistakable twitch of the fingers. Barely perceptible, but real. Someone screamed. A chair scraped against the wooden floor as someone stumbled backward. The priest clutched his cross, his lips moving in silent prayer. Henry yanked his hand back, his expression unreadable, but his jaw tightened. Clara's heart pounded in her ears. The room was unraveling, the tension morphing into panic. Some people were already backing toward the doors, muttering about demons, about unnatural forces at work. Others stared at the body, caught between horror and disbelief. Lucy's grip on her mother's hand tightened. "I told you," she whispered, her voice carrying an eerie certainty. "Daddy called my name." And then, just as Henry turned toward Clara, his lips parting to speak, the corpse's chest rose. A shallow, rasping breath. And then another. The dead man was breathing. A collective gasp rippled through the room as the dead man, no longer dead, sucked in another rattling breath. His eyelids fluttered, and a strained, guttural sound escaped his throat. Clara's body locked up, her mind screaming at her to run, but her legs refused to move. Henry staggered back, his hand clenching into a fist as if trying to steady himself. This isn't possible," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucy, however, didn't flinch. She stood still, her small frame trembling, but her eyes never left her father's face. "I told you," she said again, her voice eerily calm. "I told you he wasn't gone." The priest dropped to his knees, whispering prayers under his breath. Some of the mourners scrambled for the exit, while others stood frozen in place, their faces pale and drawn. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the corpse, the man, shuddered violently and let out a low, rasping groan. His lips parted, and the room fell into dead silence. Clara felt her stomach twist into a knot as his voice, weak but unmistakable, broke through the silence. "They'd lied to you," he wheezed, his breath shallow and strained. His fingers twitched as if trying to grasp something, someone. Everything was a lie. A cold dread crawled up Clara's spine. She turned to Henry, whose face had gone completely white. His eyes darted between the man in the coffin and Lucy, as if a horrifying realization was dawning upon him. The dead man took another trembling breath. His eyes, glassy but aware, locked onto Henry. And then, with visible effort, he forced out a single name. "Henry." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. The room erupted. Voices overlapped in chaos, some shouting in confusion, others in terror. Clara heard gasps, sobs, and footsteps rushing toward the doors. The priest made the sign of the cross, his murmured prayers frantic. But Clara didn't move. She could barely breathe, because Henry, who had always been calm, always in control, had taken a step back. His hands trembled, his expression a war between shock and something else. Something closer to fear. Lucy turned to face him now, her wide eyes gleaming under the dim light. "You knew," she whispered, the innocence in her voice cracking like fragile glass. Henry swallowed hard. "I don't." "You knew," she repeated, her voice rising. "You knew my daddy wasn't dead." The room fell into an eerie hush as everyone turned toward Henry. The way the accusation bore down on him like a crushing tide. His lips parted, but no words came out. And then, from the coffin, the man gasped sharply, his whole body convulsing. With one final burst of strength, he reached forward, toward Henry, and rasped out one last, damning sentence. "You did this." Then his body went limp. The breath left him for the second time. But the damage was done. The truth had been spoken. And no one in that room would ever look at Henry the same way again. A sharp, unnatural crack echoed through the room, freezing every breath, every heartbeat. The sound, like splintering wood mixed with something wet and unnatural, sent a shiver down Clara's spine. The coffin shook violently, the polished mahogany lid rattling as if something inside was desperately trying to break free. Screams erupted. Chairs scraped against the floor as mourners bolted for the doors, some clutching their rosaries, others barely holding back sobs of terror. The priest backed away, his trembling hands forming frantic crosses in the air as he muttered prayers in Latin. Clara stood paralyzed, her pulse hammering in her ears. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the coffin. It lurched again, harder this time. Then suddenly a deep, ragged gasp from inside. The breath of something that should have been dead. Lucy clutched Clara's arm, her small fingers digging into flesh. "I told you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising panic. "I told you he wasn't gone." The coffin jerked once more, and then the lid snapped open. A collective scream filled the room as the body inside sat up. Pale, rigid fingers curled over the wooden edges, the nails cracked and raw. His head lifted, his eyes glassy and unfocused, rolled back before locking onto the terrified crowd. His lips parted, and a hoarse, wheezing sound crawled from his throat. Henry staggered back, knocking over a chair. "No," he choked out. This can't be happening." But it was happening. The dead man, or whatever he had become, twisted his neck with a sickening pop, his movements jerky and unnatural, as if he were a marionette being forced upright by invisible strings. His mouth opened wider, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rasping breaths. Then he spoke. "You cannot escape." Lucy's grip on Clara tightened. He remembers. The man in the coffin, no longer a corpse, but something else, began to move. His arms trembled as he tried to lift himself out of the box that had been meant to contain him forever. Henry turned, his face ashen. "We have to leave." "No." But before anyone could move, the corpse's fingers twitched, and then he lunged forward. The funeral had become something else. No longer a farewell to the dead. It had become a reckoning. The air was thick with fear and anger, an oppressive weight that pressed down on everyone in the dimly lit hall. The villagers had gathered, their faces pale but resolute, torches casting flickering shadows on the old stone walls. At the center of it all stood Henry, his jaw clenched, his fists curled tight at his sides. He could feel their hostility, their distrust. It burned in their eyes like embers waiting to ignite. "You brought this upon us, Henry," an elderly man shouted, his voice hoarse with fury. "That thing in the coffin, it should have stayed buried." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and a woman, gripping her child's hand tightly, stepped forward. "We told you not to dig into the past. We told you some things are better left alone." Her voice cracked, equal parts anger and fear. Henry's chest rose and fell with controlled breaths. He scanned the faces before him, recognizing neighbors, friends, people he had known all his life. But now they looked at him as if he were the enemy. "You think I wanted this?" Henry's voice was low but sharp, cutting through the angry whispers. "You think I planned for the dead to rise?" He stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the wooden floor. "Something unnatural is happening here, and if you think killing me will stop it, then you're all bigger fools than I thought." A younger man, barely in his 20s, brandished a hunting knife. His hand shook, but his determination was unwavering. "You knew the stories," he spat. "You knew what happens when you disturb the cursed graves. Yet you did it anyway." The crowd rumbled with agreement, growing bolder. Someone threw a rock. It struck the ground near Henry's foot with a dull thud. Henry exhaled sharply, his patience thinning. "I didn't disturb anything. I was searching for the truth. And if you all weren't so afraid of shadows and superstition, you'd see that we have bigger problems than blaming me." Silence. For a moment, the villagers hesitated. But then another voice rose from the back, this one deeper, filled with something darker than mere anger. "It's too late, Henry." The crowd parted slightly, and from the darkness emerged the village's eldest seer, her face lined with age, her cloudy eyes filled with knowledge far beyond what anyone else could comprehend. She carried a wooden staff, its tip wrapped in dried herbs and strange markings carved along its length. "The curse has awakened," she murmured. "And now blood will be demanded." A chilling wind howled through the open door behind Henry, rattling the shutters. The torches flickered violently, as if the very air had begun to breathe. Henry's blood turned to ice. He wasn't sure what terrified him more, the warning in her voice or the fact that, deep down, he knew she was right. The room was suffocatingly silent, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on everyone present. Henry stood at the center of it all, his face drawn with exhaustion, his mind racing as the pieces of the puzzle finally began to fall into place. The villagers, once so adamant in their fear and accusations, now watched him with wary, uncertain eyes. The elder seer's words still lingered in the air like a heavy curse. "The curse has awakened, and now blood will be demanded." Henry swallowed hard. He turned to the seer, his voice steady but edged with urgency. "Tell me exactly what you mean. No more riddles. No more cryptic warnings. If there's a curse, if there's a reason for all this horror, I want the truth." The old woman's pale, milky eyes flickered with something unreadable. She ran a bony hand over the carvings on her staff, as if drawing strength from the ancient symbols etched into the wood. "The dead do not rise without reason, Henry," she murmured. Someone has broken the balance." A murmur spread through the crowd. Henry clenched his fists. "Who?" The silence stretched unbearably long. Then, from the far end of the room, a weak voice whispered, "It was never just an old grave, was it?" All eyes turned toward Lucy, the young woman who had been at Henry's side through it all. She looked pale, her hands trembling slightly as she met Henry's gaze. "We thought we were just uncovering history," she continued, her voice barely above a breath. "But we weren't. We were disturbing something that was meant to stay hidden." Henry felt his stomach tighten. He knew she was right. The moment they had unearthed the coffin, the cursed coffin, everything had started unraveling. The strange whispers in the wind, the nightmares, the sudden sickness that had taken hold of some villagers, and now the dreadful sound that had echoed from inside that coffin just hours ago. The elder seer exhaled, nodding. This was not an ordinary grave. It was a prison. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Henry's breath caught in his throat. A prison for what? The seer's grip tightened around her staff. Not what? Who? A chill ran down Henry's spine. He had feared this answer. Somewhere deep inside, he had already suspected it. The body in that coffin, the old woman's voice trembled, heavy with years of fear and knowledge. It was never meant to rest. It was sealed away, bound by ancient rites, meant to be forgotten forever. But you, Henry, you have set it free. The villagers erupted in hushed panic, their whispers frantic. Some looked at Henry with renewed fear, others with pure dread. Henry's mind reeled. He wanted to deny it. He wanted to believe this was all just myth and superstition. But the truth was clawing its way into the light, undeniable and horrifying. And somewhere, in the depths of the darkened village, a presence that had long been imprisoned was waking up. The weight of the seer's words settled over the room like a thick fog, suffocating and inescapable. The villagers stood frozen, their faces pale with fear and suspicion. All eyes were on Henry, waiting, demanding an answer. His heart pounded against his ribs, but he knew there was no running from the truth anymore. With a slow, unsteady breath, he took a step forward. His hands trembled, but he did not try to hide it. He met the seer's gaze first, then turned to Lucy, and finally to the frightened faces of the villagers. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." His voice was raw, stripped of all pretense. "I swear, I didn't know what we were dealing with. When we found the coffin, I thought it was just another relic, another forgotten piece of history." His words felt hollow even to himself. The old seer narrowed her eyes. "And yet you ignored the warnings, the signs." Henry swallowed hard. "I thought they were just stories. Superstition." His voice wavered, heavy with regret. "But I was wrong. So very wrong." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some looked at him with pity, others with anger. "Do you know what you've done?" A voice rang out, Old Man Wallace, his gnarled hands clenching the wooden cane he barely needed. His weathered face twisted in fury. "You've doomed us all." Henry flinched, but he didn't look away. "I tried to stop it. After we opened the coffin, I started to feel it. The air changed. The shadows seemed longer, darker. And then the dreams started. The whispers. I knew something wasn't right. I tried to put it back, but it was too late." The seer's voice was heavy with finality. Henry let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "It was already too late the moment we laid eyes on that coffin." Lucy stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm. "Henry, what did you see? What did you hear?" Henry hesitated, his breath shallow. The memories clawed at his mind, vivid and inescapable. "The first night after we unearthed it, I woke up in my tent, and I wasn't alone." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Something was there, watching me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it cold, heavy, like a presence pressing down on my chest." He swallowed hard. Then the voices started. They whispered my name, told me to listen, told me that the coffin was never meant to be opened, that what was inside wasn't dead. The room fell into a stunned silence. Henry exhaled shakily, his hands clenching into fists. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was just imagining things. But then the livestock started dying. The sickness spread. And that sound, his voice broke, that thing inside the coffin, it moved. Gasps erupted through the crowd. A woman clutched her child closer. The seer's face darkened. You heard it move? Henry nodded, his throat dry. I felt it move. The tension in the room was suffocating. Then, from the back of the crowd, a deep, gravelly voice spoke. If what you're saying is true, it was Matthew, the village blacksmith, his massive frame rigid with barely contained dread. Then we're not dealing with a curse anymore. A heavy silence followed. The seer closed her eyes, as if already knowing the answer. What are we dealing with, then? Henry's voice was barely above a whisper, but it sent chills through every soul in the room. Something that was never meant to wake up. A frantic urgency filled the air as the villagers gathered around Samuel's limp body. His skin was deathly pale, his breath shallow, barely perceptible. Lucy knelt beside him, pressing trembling fingers against his neck. He's alive, she gasped, relief flooding her voice. But just barely. Henry dropped to his knees beside her. His hands hovered over Samuel's chest, uncertain. His mind raced. They had brought this upon themselves. He had brought this upon them. Now he had to fix it. We need to get him warm, Matthew, the blacksmith barked. Get blankets now. Villagers scrambled, bringing whatever they could. Wool cloaks, old quilts, anything to stop the creeping chill that clung to Samuel's body. Someone stoked the fire in the corner, its glow flickering weakly against the damp walls. But Henry knew warmth alone wouldn't be enough. Not against this. Lucy's hands tightened into fists. It's not just the cold, she muttered, her voice shaking. It's something else. Something is holding him. The seer, her old eyes clouded with knowing, stepped forward. The coffin was not just a prison, she murmured. It was a barrier, a seal. And when it was broken, her gaze fell to Samuel's still form. Something reached through. Henry clenched his jaw. Then we have to pull him back. How? Lucy demanded, eyes flashing. Do you even know what we're fighting? Henry didn't. Not completely. But he knew one thing. They couldn't let Samuel slip away. Taking a steadying breath, he placed his hands firmly over Samuel's chest. The air around them seemed to hum, charged with an unseen force. I don't know if this will work, he admitted, but I'm not letting him die. The seer nodded solemnly. Then you must act quickly. The room fell into hushed anticipation as Henry closed his eyes. He focused on Samuel, on the weak rise and fall of his chest, on the coldness creeping through his skin. He willed every ounce of warmth of life back into him. Then Samuel shuddered. His breath hitched, his fingers twitched. A low, rasping sound crawled up his throat. Henry's heart pounded. Samuel. For a moment, nothing. And then Samuel's eyes snapped open. But what looked back at them wasn't entirely him. His pupils were blown wide, his expression blank. His lips parted, but the voice that came out wasn't his own. It was hollow, ancient. You should not have woken me. A chill surged through Henry's veins. Something had come back with him.